The most dangerous picture is never the one you take on purpose. It is the one you were never meant to see. Daniel Brooks had always believed a camera revealed the truth, but on a cool October evening in downtown Chicago, it captured something that would quietly change the course of his life forever. At 24 years old, Daniel was still trying to establish himself as a freelance photographer. Most days were filled with coffee shops, local festivals, engagement sessions, and architecture assignments that barely covered his rent. He loved finding beauty in ordinary places, believing every stranger carried a story hidden behind an expression or a passing glance. That evening, he wandered through the historic warehouse district searching for interesting reflections after a brief rainstorm had left the streets shimmering beneath rows of amber streetlights. The city felt strangely peaceful for a Friday night. Distant traffic echoed between brick buildings while the wind carried the faint sound of jazz from a nearby restaurant. Daniel adjusted the settings on his old camera and lifted it toward an abandoned factory whose broken windows reflected the glowing skyline. Just as he pressed the shutter, movement caught the corner of his eye. Across the narrow street, several luxury vehicles rolled silently through an iron gate before disappearing into a private courtyard surrounded by tall stone walls. Curious more than cautious, Daniel instinctively turned his lens toward the unexpected scene. He zoomed in only long enough to frame the architecture and the elegant entrance, believing he was photographing an interesting example of restored industrial design. Standing beneath the soft exterior lights was a man whose calm presence seemed to command the attention of everyone around him without a single spoken word. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat over a black suit, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably confident. Silver streaks of rain still clung to the pavement around polished shoes that reflected the city lights. His expression remained composed, unreadable, almost distant, but there was something unexpectedly gentle in the way he acknowledged an elderly employee entering the courtyard with a respectful nod before continuing inside. Daniel clicked the shutter once, then twice, never realizing the camera had perfectly captured the man's face. He lowered the lens, satisfied with what he assumed would become another collection of urban photographs, and continued walking toward the riverfront without giving the encounter another thought. Less than 15 minutes later, he settled onto a bench overlooking the Chicago River and began reviewing the evening's images. Most were exactly what he expected until one photograph filled the screen. The mysterious man stood sharply in focus while the glowing city lights blurred behind him like scattered stars. Daniel frowned, studying the striking composition. There was something strangely familiar about the face, though he could not remember where he had seen it before. Before he could think any further, his phone buzzed with a message from a photographer friend. The words appeared across the screen one line at a time. Turn on the local news. Right now, Daniel opened the live broadcast. A reporter stood outside the very same warehouse district discussing an influential businessman whose identity remained the subject of endless rumors throughout the city. As the camera briefly displayed a recent file photograph, Daniel's pulse slowed instead of racing. The face on the television was identical to the one resting inside his camera. Adrian Moretti, the man countless headlines called the most untouchable figure in Chicago. Daniel looked back at the photograph in complete silence, unaware that somewhere else in the city, someone had already begun searching for the camera that now rested in his hands. Daniel barely slept that night. Long after the city lights faded beyond his apartment window, the photograph remained open on his laptop screen while unanswered questions circled endlessly through his mind. Every news report described Adrian Moretti with careful words that revealed almost nothing. Influential businessman, private investor, community donor. Rumors filled the spaces between those titles, yet no reporter ever seemed willing to explain why so many powerful people spoke his name with cautious respect. Daniel finally closed the laptop just before sunrise, convincing himself that the simplest solution was to delete the photograph and move on with his ordinary life. But when morning arrived, he found himself unable to press the delete key. Something about the image refused to let go of him. It was not fear. It was curiosity. Later that afternoon, Daniel accepted a last-minute assignment to photograph the opening of a restored art gallery downtown. The event was elegant but predictable, filled with local artists, journalists, and business leaders exchanging polite conversations beneath bright white lights. Daniel focused on candid portraits, grateful for work that distracted him from the strange events of the previous evening. Just as he finished photographing a sculpture near the entrance, a well-dressed man approached him with an easy smile. "Mr. Brooks?" he asked politely. Daniel lowered his camera. "Yes." The stranger handed him a simple white business card with no company logo, only an address printed in clean black letters. "Mr. Moretti would appreciate a few minutes of your time. A car is waiting outside whenever you are ready." Daniel stared at the card, expecting the man to explain further, but instead he offered a respectful nod before quietly walking away into the crowd. Daniel's first instinct was to leave through another exit. His second was to call someone. Instead, he found himself standing on the sidewalk a few minutes later, looking at a black luxury sedan parked beneath a row of maple trees. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door without saying a word. There were no demands, no raised voices, only an invitation delivered with surprising courtesy. Curiosity overcame hesitation. Daniel climbed inside. The drive lasted nearly 30 minutes through quiet neighborhoods before the car stopped outside an impressive stone estate hidden behind tall iron gates and carefully maintained gardens. Everything about the property suggested privacy rather than excess. Inside, polished wood floors reflected warm afternoon light, while shelves filled with books lined the walls instead of expensive decorations Daniel had expected to find. A house manager welcomed him with coffee and asked him to make himself comfortable. No one searched his camera. No one questioned him. The silence itself became unsettling. After several minutes, footsteps echoed softly across the hallway. Adrian Moretti entered the library wearing a dark blue suit without a tie, looking less like the mysterious figure from the photograph and more like someone returning home after an ordinary workday. He thanked the house manager before sitting across from Daniel. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Adrian's expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost impossible to read. Finally, he looked toward the camera resting beside Daniel's chair. "You have an excellent eye," he said quietly. Daniel blinked in surprise. That was not the conversation he had expected. Adrian folded his hands together and continued with the same composed voice. "Tell me something honestly, Mr. Brooks." Daniel met his gaze despite the uncertainty growing inside him. Adrian asked only one question. "When you took that photograph, what exactly did you believe you were seeing?" Daniel hesitated before answering. Every instinct warned him to choose his words carefully, yet something about Adrian Moretti's steady gaze made dishonesty seem impossible. "I thought I was photographing a building," Daniel admitted. "The light, the architecture, the reflections after the rain. I noticed people arriving, but I never intended to photograph anyone specifically." Adrian listened without interrupting. His expression never hardened, nor did it soften. It remained composed, as though he were weighing every sentence instead of searching for reasons to doubt it. After a quiet moment, he nodded once. "That is exactly what I believed when I saw the image." Daniel blinked. "You saw it?" Adrian glanced toward the camera resting beside Daniel's chair. "One of my security advisors recognized the angle before the photograph ever reached anyone else. They assumed your intentions were different from what I suspected." Daniel felt a chill despite the warmth of the library. "Then why invite me here?" Adrian leaned back slightly. "Because assumptions have a way of creating unnecessary problems." The answer surprised Daniel more than any threat could have. He had expected accusations, demands, perhaps even pressure to surrender every photograph on his camera. Instead, Adrian reached for a leather folder resting on the table and slid it across the polished wood. Inside were printed copies of newspaper headlines from recent weeks. Every article discussed anonymous figures competing for influence across the city. None mentioned specific crimes, yet together they painted a picture of growing tension beneath Chicago's polished skyline. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the folder. "There are people who would very much like to possess the photograph you accidentally created," he said quietly. "Not because of what it shows today, but because they believe it might reveal something tomorrow." Daniel frowned. "It is only one picture." Adrian's faint smile carried more understanding than amusement. "To an artist, perhaps. To people searching for patterns, every detail becomes valuable." Silence settled between them once again. Through the tall library windows, autumn leaves drifted gently across the gardens outside. The peaceful setting felt strangely disconnected from the conversation unfolding inside. Daniel finally asked the question that had followed him since the previous evening. "Are you asking me to delete it?" Adrian looked directly at him. "No." Daniel stared in surprise. Adrian continued before the silence could grow. "I am asking you to understand that the photograph has already attracted attention beyond your control. Even if you erase every copy, there are people who know it existed." Daniel slowly lowered his eyes toward the folder. The realization settled heavily inside him. The choice he thought he still possessed had quietly disappeared before he ever entered the estate. Adrian stood and walked toward the window, watching gardeners trim hedges beneath the afternoon sun. His voice remained calm when he spoke again. "You may leave whenever you wish, Mr. Brooks. No one here will stop you." Daniel looked up, relieved for only a brief second before Adrian added, "But once you leave these gates, I cannot promise everyone outside will show you the same courtesy." Daniel followed Adrian's gaze toward the quiet grounds beyond the glass. For the first time since arriving, he understood that the estate did not feel like a prison. It felt like the only place where nobody expected anything from him except the truth. Somewhere beyond the iron gates, unseen eyes were searching for a camera. Inside the library, the man the city feared most had offered him something far more unexpected than protection. He had offered him a choice, and Daniel was no longer certain which path carried the greater risk. Daniel remained at the estate that evening, not because anyone insisted, but because every logical path leading away from it seemed filled with questions he could no longer answer alone. A guest room overlooking the gardens had quietly been prepared before he accepted the invitation to stay. It felt more like a boutique hotel than the hidden headquarters he had imagined from countless rumors. Fresh flowers rested beside the window. Shelves held classic American novels, and an untouched sketchbook had been placed on the writing desk, as though someone believed every creative person eventually needed blank pages. Daniel wandered through the room in thoughtful silence before setting his camera carefully beside the bed. The photograph that had turned his ordinary week upside down remained stored inside its memory card, yet no one had demanded to see it again. That absence of pressure unsettled him more than any interrogation could have. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, a house manager knocked softly on the door and invited Daniel to dinner. Expecting a grand formal dining hall, he instead found Adrian seated alone in a quiet breakfast room overlooking the estate gardens. A single table had been prepared for 2 people. Simple pasta, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and coffee filled the table without unnecessary extravagance. Adrian looked up from a folder he had been reading and motioned toward the empty chair across from him. "Please," he said, "you have been traveling all day." Daniel hesitated only briefly before sitting down. For several minutes they ate without discussing the photograph, the headlines, or the rumors surrounding the city. Instead, Adrian asked about Daniel's favorite places to photograph in Chicago. Daniel spoke cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm as he described old neighborhoods, river reflections after rain, hidden bookstores, and quiet mornings when sunlight transformed familiar streets into something entirely new. Adrian listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that revealed an unexpected appreciation for architecture and history. Daniel found himself forgetting who sat across from him. The conversation felt surprisingly normal. After dinner, Adrian led him through a private hallway lined with black and white photographs taken decades earlier. Families, construction workers, musicians, teachers, and neighborhood celebrations filled the frames. Daniel stopped in front of an image showing children laughing beneath falling autumn leaves. "Who took these?" he asked. Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My mother," he answered. She believed photographs preserved kindness more faithfully than memory ever could. Daniel looked back at the collection with new understanding. The walls did not celebrate power. They celebrated ordinary lives. Later, while walking through the library once more, Daniel noticed Adrian quietly stopping to greet every employee they encountered by name. A groundskeeper proudly showed photographs of his granddaughter's school recital. Adrian smiled warmly and congratulated him before asking whether she had enjoyed the performance. A housekeeper mentioned her husband's upcoming surgery, and Adrian reminded her to take as much time away from work as her family needed. None of the conversations felt rehearsed. They happened naturally, without anyone appearing surprised by his concern. Daniel remembered every newspaper article he had ever read describing Adrian as an untouchable figure hidden behind mystery and influence. Yet the man standing before him looked nothing like those headlines. As Daniel returned to his room later that night, he paused beside the window overlooking the quiet estate. Beyond the iron gates, the city still viewed Adrian Moretti as someone defined entirely by whispers and speculation. Inside those gates, Daniel had begun seeing something far more complicated. For the first time since taking the accidental photograph, curiosity had slowly become stronger than fear, and he wondered whether the greatest mystery he had captured with his camera had never been the image itself, but the man standing inside it. Morning sunlight spilled across the estate gardens, painting the dew-covered grass in shades of gold that made the entire property feel more like a quiet countryside retreat than the place described in countless newspaper rumors. Daniel woke earlier than expected, carrying his camera outside after receiving permission from the house manager to photograph the grounds. Every corner seemed carefully preserved. Ancient oak trees lined the winding stone paths, fountains reflected the pale blue sky, and climbing roses softened the tall brick walls surrounding the estate. Daniel instinctively searched for dramatic compositions, yet his attention kept drifting toward ordinary moments instead. A chef carried fresh herbs from the garden while exchanging jokes with the groundskeeper. Two maintenance workers paused to admire a family of birds nesting beneath the roof of a nearby gazebo. Nothing about the morning matched the dangerous image Daniel had imagined before arriving. As he adjusted the focus on his camera, Adrian appeared at the far end of the garden wearing a simple dark sweater instead of the tailored suits Daniel had seen before. Without security surrounding him, he looked almost like any other man enjoying the quiet start of a new day. Adrian noticed Daniel photographing the roses and smiled faintly. "You are looking in the wrong direction," he said. Daniel lowered the camera with a puzzled expression. Adrian nodded toward the eastern edge of the garden, where warm sunlight streamed through rows of maple trees. "The light changes every 5 minutes there. My mother used to say that if you wait patiently, nature always gives photographers a better picture than they expected." Daniel followed the suggestion and immediately understood. The morning light transformed the narrow path into a glowing corridor filled with floating leaves and soft shadows. He captured several photographs before turning back toward Adrian with genuine surprise. "You really know photography?" Adrian looked toward the trees for a long moment before answering. "Only enough to appreciate the people who dedicate their lives to it." They continued walking together through the gardens until they reached a quiet greenhouse filled with orchids and small citrus trees. Daniel noticed an old camera resting inside a glass display case near the entrance. It showed years of careful use rather than expensive craftsmanship. Adrian gently brushed a finger across the frame. "It belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "She believed every photograph should remind someone that life is worth remembering." Daniel studied Adrian's expression. It was the first time he had seen genuine sadness quietly surface beneath the calm confidence that rarely left his face. Before Daniel could respond, Adrian changed the subject with a gentle smile. "Would you like to see the city from somewhere tourists never find?" Less than an hour later, they stood on the rooftop terrace overlooking Chicago's skyline. The view stretched for miles as morning light reflected across the river and glass skyscrapers. Daniel lifted his camera almost instinctively, but this time he did not photograph the skyline first. Without thinking, he turned the lens toward Adrian, who stood quietly watching the city below. Adrian glanced over with a curious smile rather than discomfort. Daniel lowered the camera before pressing the shutter. "I should probably ask permission first," he admitted. Adrian laughed softly, the sound warm enough to dissolve the remaining distance between them. "That is the first request anyone has made of me all week." Daniel smiled in return, realizing trust was never built through dramatic promises. It was built through small moments of respect that quietly accumulated until fear no longer occupied every conversation. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, unanswered questions still waited. Yet standing above the city together, Daniel sensed that whatever happened next would depend less on the accidental photograph and more on the unexpected connection slowly developing between two men whose lives should never have crossed paths. The peaceful rhythm of the estate lasted only until late afternoon, when Daniel noticed the atmosphere quietly shifting around him. Conversations between staff became shorter. Several employees checked their phones before exchanging thoughtful glances. No one appeared frightened, yet everyone moved with calm purpose, as though preparing for something they had rehearsed many times before. Daniel found Adrian standing alone inside the library, studying the skyline through the tall windows where the first hints of evening had begun settling across the city. Without turning around, Adrian spoke softly. "I hoped we would have another quiet day." Daniel stepped closer. "What changed?" Adrian finally faced him, his expression composed but more serious than usual. "Someone has started asking questions about a photographer who happened to be in the warehouse district that night." Daniel felt the familiar weight return to his chest. "They know it was me?" Adrian nodded once. "They know enough to begin looking." The words hung in the quiet room, not as a threat, but as a simple acknowledgement of reality. Daniel instinctively reached for the camera resting on his shoulder. For the first time since arriving, he wondered whether carrying it had become more dangerous than comforting. Adrian noticed the movement. "You still have the photograph?" Daniel answered honestly. "Yes." Adrian remained silent for several seconds before asking, "May I see it?" Daniel removed the memory card, opened the image, and handed over the camera. Adrian studied the photograph with remarkable patience. He did not focus on himself. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the background, the reflections in nearby windows, the parked vehicles, and the angle of the surrounding buildings. When he finally returned the camera, his voice carried quiet admiration. "You framed the light beautifully." Daniel blinked in surprise. "That is what you noticed?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Everyone else only sees me. You saw the city." Those words lingered in Daniel's thoughts long after they left Adrian's lips. A person who expected to be judged by power had instead been remembered through light. As evening approached, the house manager entered the library and quietly informed Adrian that dinner was ready. Before leaving, Adrian turned toward Daniel. "You are still free to leave whenever you choose." Daniel looked toward the front entrance visible through the hallway. Beyond those doors waited the familiar life he had known only days before. His apartment, his photography assignments, his ordinary routine. Everything appeared within reach. Yet something felt different now. The estate no longer represented an interruption to his life. It had become the place where strangers had shown him unexpected honesty instead of suspicion. During dinner, the conversation wandered from architecture to travel, from favorite books to the small cafes hidden throughout Chicago. Daniel laughed more than he realized, surprised by how naturally the hours passed. Later that night, he stepped onto the balcony outside his guest room. The city lights shimmered across the horizon while a cool breeze carried the distant sound of traffic. His phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message contained only one sentence. "We know where you took the picture." Daniel stared at the screen before quietly locking the phone without replying. A moment later, another message appeared, this time from Adrian. "If you receive anything unusual, tell me." Daniel looked toward the illuminated library window where Adrian was still working long after everyone else had gone to bed. For the first time since this unexpected journey began, Daniel understood that the greatest danger was no longer the photograph itself. It was the invisible line between the life he used to know and the future he had already begun stepping into. Daniel read the anonymous message several more times before finally placing the phone face down on the balcony railing. The words themselves were short, yet they carried enough uncertainty to erase the peaceful confidence he had slowly built over the past few days. He remained outside until the cool night air became too cold to ignore, then quietly made his way downstairs. The library lights were still glowing beneath the tall windows exactly as he had expected. Adrian looked up from several open documents the moment Daniel entered the room. Without a word, Daniel handed him the phone. Adrian read the message carefully before returning it. His expression remained calm, but Daniel noticed a subtle change in his eyes. The situation had become more personal than either of them wanted. "Thank you for showing me," Adrian said. "You did not have to." Daniel sat across from him with a tired smile. "A few days ago, I probably would have tried handling it alone." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" Daniel looked around the quiet library, the shelves of books, the old photographs, and the warm light that somehow made the enormous room feel welcoming rather than intimidating. "Now I know I am not alone." Silence settled comfortably between them. Adrian closed the folder on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "There is something you deserve to understand," he said. The people searching for that photograph are not interested in you as a person. They are interested in what they believe you might know. Daniel frowned. But I do not know anything. Adrian offered a faint smile. Unfortunately, they do not know that. The following morning, Adrian suggested they leave the estate for a few hours. Daniel expected another formal meeting or business appointment, but instead Adrian drove them himself through quiet Chicago neighborhoods until they arrived at a small family-owned cafe overlooking Lake Michigan. There were no reserved tables, no security standing nearby, and no special treatment from the staff. The owner greeted Adrian by his first name and immediately asked whether he wanted his usual breakfast. Daniel watched the exchange with genuine curiosity. "You come here often?" Adrian laughed softly. "My mother brought me here every Saturday when I was a child." They ordered coffee and fresh pastries before choosing a table beside the large front window. Outside, runners followed the lakeside trail, while families walked their dogs beneath bright autumn trees. For nearly an hour, they talked about everything except the photograph. Daniel spoke about his dream of publishing a book filled with ordinary moments that most people overlooked. Adrian admitted he had once wanted to study architecture before life had taken him in another direction. The conversation felt effortless, as though years of friendship had quietly replaced only days of acquaintance. As they prepared to leave, Daniel noticed a little girl standing outside with a disposable camera, struggling to understand how to wind the film. Without hesitation, he stepped over and patiently showed her how to hold the camera steady before taking a picture of her parents. The little girl smiled proudly after hearing the shutter click. Adrian watched the interaction from several feet away, saying nothing until they returned to the car. "That is why I trusted you," he said quietly. Daniel looked over in surprise. Adrian started the engine before continuing. "Anyone can take a photograph. Very few people noticed the person standing behind the lens." Daniel turned toward the passing skyline, feeling those words settle somewhere deep inside him. The photograph that had brought them together was beginning to matter less than every conversation that had followed it. For the first time since walking through the estate gates, Daniel realized he was no longer staying because of fear. He was staying because, somewhere between quiet breakfasts, shared stories, and unexpected honesty, he had chosen to trust the man everyone else only thought they knew. The return drive to the estate felt quieter than any conversation Daniel and Adrian had shared before, yet the silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. As the city skyline slowly disappeared behind rows of autumn trees, Daniel found himself realizing how completely his first impression had changed. He had entered Adrian's world believing he was meeting a man defined by rumors. Instead, he had discovered someone whose greatest strength seemed to be the quiet responsibility he accepted without asking anyone to notice. Late that afternoon, Daniel wandered back into the library carrying his camera. He had not taken another photograph of Adrian since their morning on the rooftop, but something felt different now. He wanted to create an image that reflected the person he had come to know rather than the public figure everyone else imagined. Adrian stood beside one of the tall windows reading correspondence while soft afternoon light filtered through the glass, surrounding the room with warm golden tones. Daniel paused before lifting the camera. "May I?" he asked. Adrian looked up with a small smile. "You already asked once. That tells me everything I need to know." Daniel raised the camera and waited instead of pressing the shutter immediately. He watched the changing light, remembering Adrian's mother's belief that patience always rewarded photographers. Finally, the sunlight settled perfectly across the room, illuminating Adrian's thoughtful expression without making him appear larger than life. The shutter clicked only once. Daniel lowered the camera and reviewed the image. There were no symbols of influence, no expensive surroundings demanding attention. Only a man standing quietly beside a window, looking completely at peace. Adrian stepped closer. "Is it any good?" Daniel smiled. "It looks honest." Adrian studied Daniel's face rather than the camera screen. "Then it is probably your best work." Before Daniel could answer, the house manager entered carrying a small envelope that had arrived by courier. Adrian opened it, reading the single page inside before placing it back into the envelope with measured calm. Daniel noticed the subtle change in his expression. "More questions?" Adrian nodded. "Not for you anymore." Daniel looked confused. Adrian walked toward the fireplace before continuing. "The people searching for the photograph have realized it tells them nothing useful. They have begun looking somewhere else." Daniel let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. The invisible weight resting on his shoulders since the night of the accidental photograph seemed to lift all at once. Adrian noticed the relief and smiled gently. I told you curiosity often creates more problems than truth. Evening settled peacefully across the estate. After dinner, they walked through the gardens beneath strings of soft lights that illuminated the winding paths. Fallen leaves drifted quietly across the stone walkway, while the fountain reflected the first stars appearing overhead. Daniel stopped near the greenhouse where they had spoken days earlier. I have been thinking about something, he admitted. Adrian waited patiently. Daniel looked toward the city lights glowing beyond the distant trees. When I first arrived here, I kept wondering when I would finally be able to leave. He turned back with an honest smile that surprised even himself. Now I am wondering why I was so determined to leave in the first place. Adrian's expression softened in a way Daniel had never seen before. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence that followed. Sometimes the most important answers required no explanation at all. Standing beneath the quiet autumn sky, Daniel understood that trust had never arrived in a single dramatic moment. It had grown through ordinary conversations, shared mornings, and simple acts of kindness until one unexpected truth became impossible to ignore. The photograph that had accidentally brought two strangers together had quietly become the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. Several months later, Daniel Brooks stood inside the largest gallery he had ever been invited to exhibit, surrounded by photographs that captured the quiet beauty of everyday life across Chicago. Morning commuters crossing old bridges, children chasing autumn leaves through neighborhood parks, elderly couples sharing coffee beside the river, musicians performing beneath glowing streetlights. Every image celebrated ordinary moments that most people hurried past without noticing. Visitors moved slowly from one frame to another, pausing not because the photographs were dramatic, but because they felt honest. Daniel had spent years believing the perfect picture depended on extraordinary subjects. Now he understood that the greatest stories often lived inside the smallest gestures. At the center of the gallery hung a single black and white portrait beneath soft overhead lighting. It showed a man standing beside a tall library window while afternoon sunlight rested gently across his face. There were no expensive suits demanding attention, no symbols of influence, and no carefully constructed image of authority. Only quiet thoughtfulness, calm dignity, and the peaceful expression of someone carrying responsibilities the world could not fully see. The title beneath the frame read simply, "The Man Beyond the Headlines." Throughout the afternoon, dozens of visitors stopped in front of that photograph longer than any other. Some admired the composition. Others quietly discussed the emotion in the subject's eyes. Not one person recognized the private story hidden behind the image, and Daniel preferred it that way. The portrait had never been created to reveal secrets. It existed to remind people that every life looked different once someone chose to see with compassion instead of assumption. As the exhibition continued, the gallery doors opened once more. Adrian Moretti entered wearing a simple navy overcoat that allowed him to blend naturally among the other guests. No announcements followed his arrival. No one gathered around him. He walked slowly through the gallery, studying each photograph with the same patience Daniel had come to admire over the past several months. When he finally reached the portrait at the center of the room, he remained there in thoughtful silence before turning toward Daniel with a quiet smile. "You kept your promise," Adrian said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Which one?" Adrian looked back at the photograph. "You captured the person instead of the rumor." Daniel smiled, remembering the evening when one accidental photograph had introduced them under circumstances neither could have predicted. "You taught me the difference," he answered. For a moment, they simply stood together while visitors continued moving peacefully around the gallery. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted gently through the evening air, covering the city in quiet white. Daniel realized that the photograph, which had once seemed like the greatest mistake of his career, had quietly become the doorway to the most meaningful chapter of his life. It had led him beyond fear, beyond assumptions, and beyond the stories strangers invented about one another. More importantly, it had introduced him to someone who proved that trust was not earned through reputation, but through consistent kindness shown when nobody expected recognition. As the gallery lights reflected softly across the framed photographs, Daniel understood that every meaningful journey begins with a single moment nobody plans for. Sometimes it is one unexpected conversation. Sometimes it is one act of quiet compassion. And sometimes it is one accidental photograph that reminds two strangers they were never defined by the stories the world told about them, but by the choices they made after finally seeing each other clearly.